So when the persecution of Falun Gong started in 99, and all of a sudden you're faced against this entire propaganda machine from Beijing, had you any sense of what you were up against?
None at all.
Did you know how they operate, what they do?
In terms of my knowledge of Chinese history, I knew something happened at Tiananmen Square with the students. I'd heard about this thing called the Cultural Revolution, and I thought it was like their 1960s Woodstock. Sounded pretty groovy to me. That was it. I knew next to nothing about modern Chinese history. And so it was a steep and dramatic learning curve to figure out exactly what was happening. And it took, just nights and weekends, month after month, years for my Chinese friends to kind of story after story after story about what China had been through since the communists took over, to really kind of get it into my head just exactly how they operate and what we're up against. It took a very long time. It came about because I would hear something from coming out of China, and I would think, oh, it's this. And my Chinese friends would be like shaking their head, and they'd sit me down and go, no. When they say this, they mean this. And they would sort of take me through the history. And so the first stop in my history lesson with my friends was really the Cultural Revolution, which was, in my mind, insane. Absolutely insane. The entire society just gone crazy out of political hysteria to drive home this new kind of new China, this new communist China with Mao as this sort of quasi-God figure, and absolutely destroy people, organizations, statues, Buddhist temples, anything that represented traditional culture. It was a terribly destructive and terrifying time to live. And so the Cultural Revolution was one in many, many campaigns from 49 all the way up to really, I think you could consider Tiananmen Square one of them, of these campaigns where the Chinese regime would target a segment of society, would mobilize another segment to go against that segment, and it was all driven by propaganda. And the shocking thing to me, and this was I think this was the most shocking thing, is, when you look at 1960s, 1970s style Chinese government propaganda, it's so cheesy. It's so blatantly propaganda. It's like, how could this even work?
People think of it as retro now. They have these restaurants on the walls.
Exactly. Yeah. You see it on, the walls of big producers in Hollywood and things like that. And it's like, fine as retro artwork, but no one would believe this nonsense. Not true. It was such a hysteric time where it really drove the whole thing. If you think about it, what would cause a young man or a young woman to beat their teacher to death, to turn in their own parents to the authorities, to face torture or worse? What kind of hysteria do you have to whip up? That's all propaganda, and it's not the ineffective propaganda that I saw through my eyes. It worked. It worked very well, and it worked in two ways. It worked in one way where people actually would believe it. There was true believers, and that is certainly the case for a significant amount of certainly the young people, maybe the broader population in China at that time. But then there's just the fear factor. The people that maybe didn't believe it, but boy, they see the hordes coming down the street with the pitchforks. They're not going to get in the way of that. And the sheer fear that people would cower in and feel throughout that period. That's one in many, many campaigns. And it really drove home how important, how paramount, actually, I would say, propaganda was to the Chinese regime. It was the mechanism. It wasn't military, it wasn't civil engineering or societal organization or technological know-how. It was its ability to wield propaganda to cower the masses, keep them divided, keep them in fear, and keep them in power, keep the Chinese regime in power. And it was a dramatic lesson for me. And unfortunately, it's a lesson even those who go through college studying China in the West, they really don't get a hands-on, person-to-person kind of education of what modern Chinese history was really like for the Chinese people, and how important propaganda was and how potent of a weapon it was.
And you think about the image that China is trying to promote in the West right now. And I think what we often fail to see is how orchestrated A lot of it is. You know, from censoring movies in Hollywood to depict a certain way, to the stuff that we're seeing in the Olympics now with the athletes and their personal stories. It's just so directed and performed. What did you see, like, over these 25 years, from the early days of persecution of Falun Gong and the propaganda all the way till now? What are some of the incidents that stick out in your mind of major propaganda attempts from the CCP?
Well, what sticks out in my mind are a few things. One was the first month, where when the persecution first started, the little propaganda that they were doing at that time was the only narrative. And so that was the first thing. It was sort of like, again, from my perspective, this is like the spiritual practice of Buddhist nature. I've been doing it for a few months, and suddenly the Wall Street Journal and all these papers are starting to have stuff saying, oh, this is a weird group, this is this, this is that. And I'm like, what? Where is this coming from? So that initial hit was the first thing I remember. The two other things I remember was, again, they were flailing around. They hadn't found the cult word yet. They hadn't, I guess, hired their PR firm yet. So it was just kind of all over the place. But when they did find that, I think it was October of that year, where the leader of China at the time, Jiang Zemin, gave this sort of famous interview with a French newspaper, and he started pushing that. And then it was systematic from that point on. Cult, 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 cult. That's all we heard for many, many months. And that was sort of the next thing, the next wave of not just that they would say that when it clearly wasn't true, but the fact that people would kind of roll with it.
Just repeat it.
Yeah, they would just repeat it, including like the pillars of our fourth estate, New York Times, Wall Street Journal. I mean, these papers, and that was a shock that kind of thing would stick that easily without enough due diligence.
Basic Goebbels technique, right? Repeat it 100 times.
Exactly. And I'd heard that theory, right, from the World War II. And I'm like, oh, that sounds awful. Glad that doesn't happen nowadays.
Yep.
And then here it was right in front of me. So that was the second thing. The third thing that was really striking was the self-immolation incident, which I think was early 2001?
Self-immolation in quotation marks.
Self-immolation incident, right. So, and I remember this very clearly because, we're 12 hours behind from China. We got a call. We got a call actually from Ian Johnson, who was one of the best reporters, I'd say, on the ground from those early years.
He won a Pulitzer Prize.
Yep, he won a Pulitzer Prize, and he really was the one who, through his Pulitzer Prize-winning series in the Wall Street Journal, really put the persecution of Falun Gong on the media map. We got a call from him, and he said, you guys need to get on this. I just got a report that there's this group of people that set themselves on fire in Tiananmen Square, and the Chinese regime is saying, it's you. What's going on? And so you sort of there was sort of this chaotic period for the next 10 hours trying to figure this out. Clearly, it's not Falun Gong people. They don't do that. They don't believe in that. Nothing in our spiritual teachings or our practice would lead to that outcome. And that was something.
It's suicide, actually.
It's suicide, exactly. Yeah. And that was something that eventually some of the reporters figured out. The Washington Post went to a hometown and investigated two of the folks, and was like, okay, these people never practiced Falun Gong. What was shocking was that the wave of propaganda that was immediately ready. Normally, you're going to write a big report about anything. It's got to go up the chains of the Communist Party, come back down, and get okayed. Stuff was ready within the hour. Yeah. And it continued the next day, and the next day, and the next week, and the next month. And it was just flooding the airwaves in China. And that was really, what struck me about that is, one, it was pretty clear early on that it was staged, but that it worked. I mean, it really was inside China, because again, Falun Gong was so popular in the 90s when Jiang Zemin launched this in July 99, there was a lot of pockets around China that were like, I don't think so. My neighbors all practice. I know, this is not. The fear of another cultural revolution was always in people's minds, but it didn't really take hold until the self-immolation. When they put enough of that on the TV, in the newspapers, that really turned the tide inside China from people understanding Falun Gong for what it was, a traditional spiritual practice that really came out of heartland Chinese culture, into, oh, this is a dangerous group. I got to separate from it. And just like the Cultural Revolution, I think there was two distinct camps. There were the people that believed it and were scared and didn't want anything to do with Falun Gong because of what they were hearing on the news. And there were the people that didn't believe that, but they're scared of the campaign. And they see the exact same idea.
Stay away from it.
Stay away from it. They're coming for Falun Gong. Don't get in the way because you're next if you do.
Yeah.
And so that third, what they did with the self-immolation and what they, in terms of imposing fear and convincing a whole segment of the population that Falun Gong, something's wrong with Falun Gong, was a real shocker. Because up until then, the Cultural Revolution was vivid and clear and very detailed from all my friends, but it was theory.
Yeah. And it was a while ago.
It was a while ago. And that was the other thing. It was a while ago. And there's this general sense of no matter how horrific the Chinese regime was in the 50s and the 60s, 20 million dead, 40 million dead, 6 million dead, there's this sense of, ancient history, right? No. And I think the self-immolation and the ensuing persecution of Falun Gong demonstrated that in no uncertain terms, that something as horrific as the Cultural Revolution or worse is entirely possible and is happening in this day and age. And that was an important lesson. I think that's still, to this day, that's something that's hard to get across to Americans because they look at, the skyline of Shanghai, the 2008 Olympics, and the recent Olympics, and they're like, huh?
Yeah.
No.
And it says something about the news cycle as well, certainly in China, but also here in the West, where now we look back years later and we know that it's debunked. There's been films about it, false fire, there's been all kinds of reports picking the story apart, but it almost doesn't matter because when it first came out, everybody believed it was parroted all over the world, and it changed public opinion. And it's been a long uphill fight since then to turn that around because such a massive, well-orchestrated propaganda campaign from the world's biggest dictatorship.
The other thing that I think it really drove home for me, again, is this idea that, we hear a lot of talk about, military spending of China. How much they spend on the military, how much they spend on this, and, all the things that they do, raising people up out of poverty and all this stuff. It is clear that the most important thing for them is the narrative.
Yeah, so it's so important for the CCP to always establish its legitimacy, and then propaganda is the number one tool.
Yeah, and I think you see that even in the modern day, they rule by that as the most important implement. They've got to continue to convince the Chinese people that they're the legitimate rulers. They're the shepherds of China. They're the shepherds of the Chinese people. They're the reason China was raised out of poverty and brought onto the world stage. That is paramount. It is the most important thing. And anything that threatens that narrative is, in their minds, an existential threat.
Now in the world of Facebook and X and YouTube, it seems like that's the new front for them.
It is. And it's, in many ways, social media is one of the most vulnerable entry points into a Western democracy.
Why is that?
Because it's freely accessed by any person in the world, including the Chinese regime and all their proxies and their 50-cent army and anybody. No one will stop them, by and large, and they can reach any American that they want, essentially, that's on the platform. I hear these comparisons to it's our town square. No, it's not. The town square had a physical dimension to it, which was important. In order to get to that town square, you had to live in the town or at least pass through. You had to have some sort of vested interest in that community. Social media is like a town square that anybody anywhere in the world with any kind of motivation can teleport into and say whatever they want. That's, that is a unique challenge because we as a country want to maintain the free speech that we get from a town square. But the fact that anybody can teleport in and do whatever they want on our town square creates an enormous problem for which we have not solved. We have not solved that issue. And how do you maintain that as a free speech location, one not allowing regimes like the CCP to come in and take over the whole, usurped this idea to basically start controlling the narrative of what we think in our town. And I think for that reason, it's one of the key vulnerabilities, and the CCP knows that. And that is, it's not an accident that is the jumping off place. It's definitely not the only platform they're going to use. But in this latest report we just did, the public security is using that as a starting point, an entry point. It's their beachhead to try and get into the narrative of America, the mainstream media, any other places they can to put propaganda in, and they're starting to become very effective at it. They have TikTok, they've had these other platforms for years, but the idea, again, that they're going to focus this on Shenyun and they're going to weaponize it is a significant escalation from what they've done in the past.
Does that mean that we should be expecting all kinds of hit pieces now?
Honestly, it's hard to say. I think the one thing's for sure is there is a significant amount of effort and resources on it, and that it's already started. We already see this on social media. There's been some traction for it already in the past, a couple of articles here and there that have definitely carried the exact propaganda points that the CCP wants. So we know there's already some traction. How big is this going to be? What's the scope of this going to look like? It's tough to say, but it's going to be more than we've seen in the past, unfortunately. And I think it means the impetus on Americans to be even more vigilant about, more skeptical what they're reading online, even what they're reading in the mainstream media, especially about a group or a topic or a person that the CCP is this focused on destroying the reputation of.
Why is the CCP so bent on destroying Shenyun? Did he feel that Shenyun could take them down?
Actually, it's a really good question, because on the surface, it's sort of like, what? What's the big deal? It's a bunch of people on stage dancing. Doesn't the CCP have bigger issues to deal with? So I think the important thing to understand is to go back to why the narrative is the most important thing. Their entire regime is based on the buy-in, by and large, of the Chinese people that they're legitimate, that they should be in power. And so anything and everything that would challenge that is an existential threat. So let's look at Shenyun. What is Shenyun from the eyes of the CCP? I think it's a few things. One, it's a clear indication of how wonderful and glorious and spiritual Chinese culture is without the CCP.
China before communism.
Before communism. The implication is
China after communism.
Exactly. And so Shenyun sort of shows the world how great China could be without communism. And that, I think, represents clearly an existential threat. I think it also shows the tyranny of the CCP. I mean, for years, in this country at least, I think generally in the West, we just think of China. We don't think of, oh, there's a ruling communist party, and then there's the Chinese nation, the people, and the culture. Those are two very different things. The Communist Party was an import, and they forcibly took over. And the show crystallizes that difference and shows, oh, actually, by showing the Chinese culture and what have you, it's like, oh, maybe the CCP, not only are they not China, maybe they're not the rightful or even benevolent sort of caretakers of the Chinese nation and the people and the culture. They're not that at all. The show does that. It shows that very clearly. And I think another reason is that, as we talked about, right, there's how many segments?
About
20 segments. One or two will show modern China. And it shows very clearly the tyranny of the CCP, how the CCP goes after Falun Gong, puts that persecution on stage for the world to see. And that shows, probably more than anything else, the true nature of the CCP in a way that they do not want the world to see. And I think that then also contributes to this idea that this show is an existential threat. It's challenging the narrative of the CCP and challenging its idea that it's the rightful ruler of China. But I think there's something else that people tend to miss. And that is, for the last 25 years, right, the CCP has been trying to convince the world, Falun Gong's a cult, they're weird, stay away from them. And it's Falun Gong people that are the Shenyun artists on stage delivering a show that is so moving and so full of hope and inspiring. People are often crying when they leave the theater. This is so amazing. So they're seeing, in their minds, a very different picture of what Falun Gong is. So the show itself completely dismantles what I'm sure is billions and billions of dollars of propaganda to try and convince the world that Falun Gong is this or that. For all those reasons, I can't think of another, certainly a show, but even another organization that so directly exposes the CCP and therefore threatens them as the legitimate rulers of China. And they look at Shenyun. We see a dance and music company. They look at Shenyun, and this is an existential threat to the most important thing that allows us to stay in power. That's why they feel worldwide they have to just destroy this. They have to get rid of it entirely. And I think that's, that goes to the heart of why from the very day one, when you guys started, Shenyun has been in the crosshairs of the CCP.
Why does this matter? Okay, so the CCP is criticizing and trying to sabotage Shenyun performing arts. Why does it matter to the American people, to people around the world?
I think there's a couple things. One is it's a powerful counterpoint to the damage the CCP propaganda does here in America. If you look at the modern times, at least, the narrative on the Chinese government, the Chinese regime, is softened the idea in the American minds of the Chinese. There's sort of this legitimacy, that is, so this aura of legitimacy that, generally speaking, has come to be in the minds of Americans because they don't understand the nature of that regime. And the show helps clean that up. It's a very potent counterpoint to the false propaganda coming out from the CCP and helping to understand what's really going on in China, both in its history and the modern day. So it's an important asset from that perspective. I think what people also need to remember is you're an American company. This is an American enterprise. It was formed by and large by first-generation immigrants who came here and with nothing built this amazing institution that is now showing Chinese culture to the world. This is yet another example of great ideas that may have started elsewhere, in this case, a wonderful culture elsewhere, coming to America, and America being the incubator of ingenuity and allowing people to create something and then share it with the world. So I think there's a point here that we should feel proud about, that we should be supporting. And the fact that the CCP is going to decide, well, this particular American company, we want that destroyed. To let them do that, I mean, what's to say they wouldn't, if they succeed in that, who's next? Maybe there's another company or another enterprise that the American, that starts here in this country or somewhere in Europe, they decide that they don't want. Are we going to let them destroy that too? And I think the last thing is, and it comes back to this new report. I mean, what is this report? I mean, sure, it's an exposition of what the CCP is planning to do to attack Shenyun in social media and our media. But really, that's a case study. And it's a case study for what? It's a case study for the CCP to be able to dictate to the American people, to people more broadly in the West, to our government, what we should be thinking on a topic they care about. If they succeed at convincing us that Shenyun is bad, that Falun Gong's bad, that means they have a capability to convince us of that, of anything else. And if we can't defend this, no one's safe, I feel.
Are you hopeful?
For sure. I'm very hopeful, but that's not to detract from the idea that it is definitely a protracted battle, and it's one that's getting quite serious. Like, for example, just a couple months ago, we were doing a research for the first report we did on Shenyun, and they showed me a picture of a demonstration of college kids, these American college kids, standing out of Shenyun Theater, holding up signs that said stuff like they were protesting the show because Falun Gong was racist. Again, coming back to the idea that this is a complete fabrication, the CCP deliberately put this out there because it's a hot button issue, and it made its way all the way down to Florida into the head of these American college kids, so much so that they're now standing out there protesting the Shenyun show. That's how far it's gone. So it is a huge problem, and this latest report we just did shows it could get a lot worse. The reason I'm hopeful, though, is because we have recently seen an unprecedented amount of support, even from areas of society that are the most subject to self-censor themselves because they don't want to anger the CCP. So, for example, this past July was the 25th anniversary of the persecution of Falun Gong. And the groundswell of support that came out from members of Congress, we had a statement issued by the Department of State, and that wasn't the only one. I mean, both this administration and the last administration has been tweeting out support, have been sanctioning Chinese officials specifically because they're persecuting Falun Gong. Prior years, that never happened. And actually this July, the American ambassador to China joined this, and he tweeted out something supporting Falun Gong. This had never happened in the 25 years we've been doing this. So these people who are even the closest to China, or the executive branch, the congressional branch of our government, are giving us more support than we've ever had. Everybody is sort of coming out and saying, look, this has gone on way too long, and it's got to stop, and we're going to start putting in real measures and taking real steps to try and get the regime to do that. So for the first time in the 25 years, just a few months ago, the House of Representatives just passed the Falun Gong Protection Act. And that's a law that has some real teeth. If we get it past the Senate, we get that signed, that allows our government to name top Chinese officials, military officials who are involved in the persecution of Falun Gong to be sanctioned, to have assets frozen. So this kind of support at all levels of the government is something that we hadn't seen before. So clearly there's this growing awareness that the CCP is a real threat, and that what they're doing to Falun Gong is a case study of what could happen. And people are wanting to put a stop to that. And so that's the part what makes me real hopeful that this can't last that long. People are getting pretty clear about why the CCP needs to be stopped and why these persecutions on Falun Gong, the targeting of Shenyun, won't stand. And I think people understand the nature of Shenyun and appreciate it far more than the propaganda is going to be able to convince them otherwise. But we gotta keep at it, because we gotta make sure that trajectory stays in that direction. Yeah.
Levi, thank you so much for all your work.
Thank you for having me, Lisha. It's good talking to you.
Likewise.
Mm.